This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we're discussing with Peter Conti-Brown his latest book, The Power and Independence of the Federal Reserve. Peter Conti-Brown is Assistant Professor of Legal Studies and Business Ethics at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, and he is the co-editor of When States Go Broke and Research Handbook on Central Banking. Peter, glad to have you on the program.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Peter, the book, The Power and Independence of the Federal Reserve, you talk a lot about, we think we know what we mean when we say the Federal Reserve is independent, and yet you argue, do we really? And there are some basic questions we have to first understand before we can really engage the question. And you kind of walk us through analysis in the opening. My question to you here at the beginning, if we think about the American constitutional order, it's both an invitation to power, as you know, and then a limitation on that power, grants of power and then divisions of that power, checking and balancing, separation of powers, federalism. Do we see those sorts of rules formally and predictably coming into play in how the Federal Reserve pursues its mission in its present-day operations?
I think that we do concretely. I'm definitely not one who sees the existential constitutional crisis at the Fed or central bank the way that Thomas Jefferson or Andrew Jackson or many others have done, largely because the Fed is a creature of Congress. It's a creature of statute. Congress can give, Congress can take away. And that stands in contrast to other central banks and other regimes, most notably in Europe. The European Central Bank has constitutional status. It's part of the treaty that created the European Union, as opposed to something the European Parliament can simply legislate out of existence. So in that sense, we see it most appropriately as we would with any other agency, independent or otherwise, of government created by Congress with some sort of interaction from the president, greater or lesser, depending on the specific issue. So I think where the Fed fits in the constitutional scheme is as an agency of Congress, much like the SEC or FTC. In that sense, it's not terribly different. Now, here's where it is quite different outside of the formal status, and that is that the independence of the Federal Reserve is much more vaunted and spoken of more gingerly by politicians and policymakers than, say, the independence of the SEC or other bureaus of government. And there, the question becomes, well, what is the power of monetary policy, of regulating the value of our currency? Is it executive? Is it legislative? Is it judicial? And the answer is, it's some of these, and sometimes it looks like something completely different, as though there were four branches of government, with the fourth being monetary. And so it does present something of a challenge to the Madisonian tripartite framework of government. And that's something that I try to think through to a slightly lesser extent. I'm not as focused on the constitutional issues.
Yeah, on this question of the independence of the Federal Reserve, you have a nice exploration of the history of power, of the exercise of power by the Federal Reserve, and how it has evolved, grown, and operated under various institutional authorities since its founding. But maybe sketch that for us and talk about that sort of first founding moment, because I'm interested in thinking of the act, the Enabling Act, or what creates it in 1913. How did they think about this question of, or as you raise, this questions of independence and power and where it fits constitutionally?
Sure. In 1913. The framers of the Federal Reserve Act are responding to a lot of different currents in U.S. society. One of them is a populist current that didn't know partisan affiliation. It was associated mostly with Democrats, but there was plenty of populist fervor in Republican strongholds as well in the Midwest. And that was very much opposed to centralized governmental and private authority. So the distinguishing factor was centralization versus decentralization, not so much government or private. So they were equally suspicious of a big Washington and a big New York City. There was another sense, though, where among, again, most often associated with Republicans at the time, but there were certainly Democratic strongholds who favored this view, which was sort of a pro-banker outlook on money. So it was in favor of a harder currency. The concentration of power in New York was less problematic because that's where the money was. And so the skepticism there was against governmental authority versus private authority. So along those two axes, centralization versus decentralization, private versus public power, came this fight. Now, we, of course, had experiments with government-sponsored banks in the 18th and 19th centuries, what we would now call a central bank. Those experiments had largely failed, but they were very close calls. The famous bank wars during the Jackson administration, we sometimes think of as a great and stunning defeat at the hands of Andrew Jackson and his great democratic movement. But that's to overstate it. This came down to a razor-thin margin, and again, it was about a veto of something that the Congress had already passed, which was to reauthorize the Second Bank of the United States. So the question was reflecting not the long-stated skepticism of central banks in the 19th century, but how close an issue this was. Those interested in having what they viewed as a better banking system supervised by a central bank, that was the challenge. It was both an intellectual one, an institutional one, and a sales challenge, how to make this palatable to the American populace.
So how
they were Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
They were facilitated in the sales job by a series of crises in the late 19th and early 20th century, the last of which was the 1907 financial panic. And it was a global panic. Its general features, the architecture of the panic looked a lot like other panics we have seen, including the 2008 crisis. There were runs on various financial institutions because of questions about the quality of their underlying assets and the fact that these institutions were engaged in what we call in banking maturity transformation. They would lend out money on longer maturities and borrow money from depositors on shorter maturities, and that creates some inherent fragility. They had mechanisms to respond to this fragility, like private clearinghouses that would be able to come in to save a bank if it was finding itself subject to one of these runs. But the whole thing sort of collapses together and is saved barely by interventions by both the U.S. Treasury and J.P. Morgan Company in New York City. Now, 6 years later, a very, very important 6 years, the Federal Reserve Act is created, striking a curious balance between the demands of those partisans who are interested in decentralized on the one hand, centralized on the other, public power on the one hand, private on the other. And they created this Federal Reserve System. It has echoes of the federal here is used carefully. The antecedent for the Federal Reserve was called the National Reserve Association. And they wanted to change that because they didn't want concentrated power. They didn't want this view of a national authority, but a federalized one. So today we think of federal meaning national, but federal also, as you pointed out at the beginning, means federalist. And the Federal Reserve System was meant to be a federalist reserve system with power devolved to the various Federal Reserve banks, 12 scattered unevenly throughout the country, and the Federal Reserve Board, located in Washington, dominated by public appointees. And that was sort of the truce, very much Wilsonian in character and design, Woodrow Wilson, among these warring factions.
So when we think about that decentralized structure, and you talk about there are three foundings in the Federal Reserve. You mentioned a latter period at the beginning of the New Deal, really with 1933, I think, and then you talk about another period, maybe the 1950s, if I remember from the book. But these are all sorts of the movements away from that decentralized structure. So in a way, as what we're seeing in the Federal Reserve, things that are mirroring largely the structure of government in America as a whole. That is a movement towards centralization, a movement towards more effective power coming from Washington. Of course, there's an open question whether that's a wisely used power. And when we see that happening in the Federal Reserve, I take it from your book, and now we have these reserve banks. And as I keep reading your book, I keep thinking, well, what are they really about now?
Yeah. Well, so when you first asked where does the Fed fit in the constitutional scheme, my first instinct was say, well, there are echoes of federalism in the Fed. But let's be very clear: a federalist system is about devolved sovereign authority. So the United States of America, Switzerland, Canada, Brazil, these are federalist systems because there are separate spheres of authority within which different sovereigns operate. The Federal Reserve System is not that. If it were, there would be 50 Federal Reserve banks, each in a sovereign state. But instead, we have 12 districts that cut through state bounds. A single state can have, Missouri has 2 Federal Reserve banks. Yeah. The state of Georgia is cut in half among districts. So there is no separate sovereign. So even during the what I call the first Federal Reserve System from 1913 1935, this was something of a mirage. So it was really more of a punt. There was an open question about where power resided in the Federal Reserve System, and as we know, power hates a vacuum, and so it became a clash of personalities. So, in the one hand, I agree with you that as we march through the 1950s and we see greater consolidation of power within the system in Washington and in what was called after 1935 the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. There remained these Federal Reserve banks, and they continued to exercise enormous authority over the shape of monetary policy and regulatory policy, but raising the question, well, who are they, and why do they get to exercise this kind of authority? We understand the U.S. Senate, with all its faults, strange though it is that Wyoming and California have equal representation in this body, the evil that Madison foresaw of the U.S. Senate. But that's written in the Constitution. We get that. Why does the Federal Reserve System get dominated by these reserve banks that were located in cities according to the politics of 1913 and 1914? Well, that's the way the structure was. And at these different founding moments that I mentioned, 1935, 1951, there's enough of a remnant left behind of these old political battles that they still shape the space within which the Fed operates even today, even though Janet Yellen is the head honcho at the Federal Reserve System and Ben Bernanke before her. That doesn't matter. The people in the room who are helping to shape these policies include the presidents of these 12 Federal Reserve banks that are federalists by misnomer only, that are actually representing private banking interests and other interests in these 12 districts that, again, have little correspondence to the states of the Union.
Talk about those other founding moments. I think that would be interesting, just to think about how the accretion of power in the Federal Reserve changes, and how it becomes more, not more, but also control and banking supervision and regulation in the course of the Fed's development, which I think contributes to this notion of independence. It seems to me, as I'm reading your book and thinking about these developments, it's some sort of belief in the loftiness of the Federal Reserve, that it has this independence, which gives it some sort of legitimacy to keep according it more and more power. And yet, you argue in the book, I take it your broad argument in the book is there's really no such thing as Fed independence.
Well, there's no such thing as Fed independence as this discrete category that either exists or doesn't exist. That's a myth. You can't answer the question, is the Fed independent, is unanswerable. As a mathematician would say, it's ill-posed, right? it's incomprehensible or incoherent. What I say about independence is about a set of relationships that change over time, and those relationships are between the Fed and external parties, the relationships among Fed insiders, the relationships between those Fed insiders and different functions, and they're about relationships that are both legal and non-legal, including and perhaps sometimes especially ideological. So the usual way we think of Fed independence, the kind of the big myth that I'm trying to explode, is the one that says we need a central bank headed by a single person, Janet Yellen, Ben Bernanke, Alan Greenspan, etc. And so we want to legally separate that person from the president so that the central banker can maintain price stability, the integrity of our currency toward price stability, which is a technocratic function, right? Yeah. So there are 5 functions, just 5 elements to this standard account, right? One, that the Federal Reserve is a person, like Alan Greenspan or Janet Yellen. 2, that the president is the one we should be worried about. The president faces a national electorate for either re-election or for maintenance of legacy, and so is going to be tempted to abuse the currency to inflate away economic problems. The third is that law is doing the work here. So we create laws, and that creates the separation. 4, that the point of the Fed is price stability, keeping prices stable, low inflation. And then last of all, that this is a technocratic function. That's just, if you get a PhD, you'll be able to do this. And I say that every one of those is false. Sometimes it's false just because it's too narrow. Like the Fed is certainly worried about price stability, but so much else besides. Sometimes false just because false. Law is not doing the work people think that it is doing in the Federal Reserve. Indeed, sometimes it's doing exactly the opposite of what people suspect it is doing. And so that's why. Sorry, go ahead.
No, continue. That's fine.
Well, this is why I think that it's better to think about Fed independence as a kind of a space within which the Fed operates that changes over time, and a set of relationships, as opposed to a light that flashes green or red when independence is present or it is not.
Yeah. Interesting listening to you describe those categories, and with much appreciation for your thesis. It is interesting when I read your book and I think about these sort of myths and sub-myths that you want to burst. It is interesting. So where do they come from? And you have some discussion of Greenspan, famously called the maestro during his tenure, particularly in the late 1990s. The immense amount of power he exercised, and you suggest in the book that there's some credence to that. And in particular, you talk about Janet Yellen. That was news to me. This sort of mini rebellion she wanted to lead, or she did lead inside the Fed. She felt like she was being slighted, and actually, so why was she being slighted? Well, she thought the economists and the experts and these high-level staffers had more power than she did as a member of the board of governors. That would seem to suggest that there is something to this expert-driven power, and then the law itself, or how law operates. Well, I suppose we want to believe, with some measure, that there is a separation between the democratic process and money stability or monetary pricing, et cetera. There is all sorts of ways, it seems to be in the book, where one can take this position, or the voter, or the citizen, not particularly reading, say, your book, Peter, sees these things, reads the Wall Street Journal, and starts to think that these things are real.
Yeah. You're right to put your finger on this history and how this history developed. And I'm a historian, so although the book itself doesn't purport to be a chronological history of the Fed, it's essential that we understand that the Fed is constantly changing. So a version of Fed history that just focuses on the 1913 Act and then says, and thus the Fed was created, and then there it goes about its work, is a false history. And so we see that these things are just constantly changing. Alan Greenspan and Paul Volcker before him, frankly, was very good at consolidating authority to himself and his staff level underlings, at the exclusion of the other public representatives, or the public's other representatives at the Fed. And again, this included Janet Yellen. She didn't lead necessarily this rebellion so much as participated in it. There were three governors who had all raised these concerns with Greenspan. But it raises the kind of question, well, what kind of central bank do we want? If we recognize these things are constantly changing, is there an idealized version of it that we should be trying to preserve against the threats of constant change? Yeah. And I think that's a valid question, and it doesn't seem to me that having a central banker in power for 20 years with enormous authority, even over our elected representatives, is that model. I don't think that's the good model, but that is exactly the model that we saw in much of the 1990s and early 2000s.
So when we think about, say, we'll take Alan Greenspan.
Yep.
Are you you've studied his tenure, and you look at his authority and the power he exercised. Are you satisfied? Because I take it in your book, there are I don't know, circumstances or informal ways in which power is checked inside the Fed, guiding the application of that power. But are you satisfied with it being, to think about the way Hayek talks about the rule of law, regular, predictable, known, and that there really are checks and balances that could prevent, say, one criticism, Greenspan, leads us straight out of the dot-com bubble, but into the housing bubble.
Yeah,
and that's the sort of power that leads to the Fed, people having really no confidence in it. And you say, as you talk about politicians regularly criticizing, and Rick Perry in one case, he would rough up Ben Bernanke if he saw him. So
yeah, right. Right.
I wonder kind of where you came out on that.
Well, I think that the problem with having a cult of personality on top of the Fed is that it's harder for dissenting views to be heard and taken seriously. Now, very obviously, I was never inside the FOMC meetings when Greenspan presided. I can only do what a scholar can do, which is read what is publicly available. But it's deeply problematic to me to have the potential for a single individual to wield so much authority over the economy and therefore the political system, when without having a check on that authority, just to make sure the ideas are sound. And so that's a pretty partisan neutral commentary. But let me tell you about what folks right of center and left of center have criticized about Greenspan. Greenspan is nobody's favorite central banker after the crisis. So to the right, led by people like John Taylor and Alan Meltzer and others, have said exactly what you said. They led us from the dot-com bubble to the housing bubble by keeping interest rates artificially low for too long from 2001 to 2004. This is an ongoing debate, right? But why would this happen? Why would it happen? If it's true that that this was a policy mistake and it's something that would have been recognized in the moment as opposed to with hindsight bias, then why would we have moved all in lockstep in this way? A second critique is of the Greenspan coming from the center left is that they just junked all of their regulatory authority, scrapped it as outside of their ideological purview, even though Congress had mandated they do so. And I include some of the good history about this, that there are times when the Fed fought the expansion of its regulatory bailiwick, on counter to our usual thoughts about how agencies function, sort of greedily seeking out ever-expanding powers. The Fed did not want so much of its consumer financial protection authority that Congress gave it in the 1970s and beyond. And Greenspan's approach to this was, I'm ideologically ill-suited for this. I'm an Ayn Randian libertarian, and so I'm not going to have anything to do with this. And he sends that message, says, well, other people can if they want to, but this is really not our job. So that's the center-left critique. Now, whether you buy either one of those, or both of them, frankly, and you could certainly ascribe to both views, the question is, why did Greenspan get to call that shot?
Yeah, that's my question as I was reading your book and thinking about the regulatory omission is that seems to go back to, well, where's the regularized control of Greenspan's power inside the Fed?
Yeah, exactly. And so in my last chapter, I include some policy proposals that I think would tamp down on the potential for Alan Greenspan to exist again. Now, I should be very, very clear. I'm not really taking a position. I'm letting those critiques have air, right? I'm discussing them, discussing Greenspan's ideologies and his worldview. But I don't really take a position on those substantive debates. What I'm saying is, if we want to avoid the situation where a president of the United States, like George Herbert Walker Bush or Bill Clinton or George W. Bush, has to get the approval of a civil servant, basically, in order for his democratically endorsed policy to come into being, then we've flipped democracy upside down. And that's exactly what we saw during this time, is presidents cultivating power with a Federal Reserve chairman who they themselves needed to reappoint. Now, formally, the legal relationship was exactly the other direction. The president got to choose. But informally, as a matter of practical politics, there was no such choice. And so what I would do is I would limit more severely than the Federal Reserve Act does now how long a single individual could serve as Fed chairman. I would say 10 years, 2 5-year terms seems adequate. And indeed, I would say that would be true for all of the Board of Governors. Have a shorter tenure that would ironically perhaps expand the actual amount of time that Fed governors serve. And it would devolve some of the authority away from just a single individual and more toward a board of governors. Now, I'm also very skeptical of that 19-person Federal Open Market Committee as both too large and not selected according to a criterion that is defensible at all, since the first Federal Reserve System was practically abolished in 1935.
So when you say the 19-member, this would be, we would create more reserve banks?
I would create. Well, I'm indifferent on the question of whether we'd create more reserve banks, but we would take the reserve bank presidents off of the FOMC. Let them be appointed by the Board of Governors to do the necessary work, to the extent that this is necessary work, of living in these various places. Spread out away from Washington, get a different view of how things work. Don't everybody sit in the same room. But then when it comes time to weigh in on and vote for the most important economic policy in our country, we're not giving those votes over to people whose selection is utterly hidden and removed from the democratic process. It'll be almost like the Supreme Court having on it being a 19-person body, only 7 of whom are appointed in the usual way of president and Senate confirmation, and the rest appointed by tort lawyers, right? Plaintiffs' lawyers. So we would never endorse that view. It would obviously be too skewed toward one another, or defense attorneys, or prosecutors, or someone else. We would never do that. And yeah, that's what we do with the Federal Reserve. And so I'm very skeptical of that existing governance structure.
On the reserve banks question, you argue also in terms of the appointment process there that you have something unconstitutional happening, particularly in light of recent cases, particularly the decision regarding Peekaboo in the Free Enterprise Fund case. I thought that was interesting as well. And yet, as I listened to you, I've been sort of thinking some of the best criticisms, to my mind, and I'm not well versed in this area, obviously, have been from guys like Richard Fisher or Thomas Hoenig at the Kansas City Bank of things that have gone on since the crisis. And I've wondered if it's precisely their independence, even though you say not publicly accountable in certain respects, but it's really their independence from Washington maybe that's given them the freedom to dissent in many respects. I think so in such a public way also to what's gone on.
I think that that's unquestionably true. I mean, this is not a costless change in governance. The old governance system is not a corrupt one. It's not an irrational one. There are real benefits for having people with a separate power base participating in these discussions. But the question is, at what point do we say, well, whose values get reflected here? And what part of the discussion, why are we seeking out the Richard Fishers or Jeffrey Lockers of the world? And also it's also important to point out that some of their decisions and arguments and dissents have been badly wrong in terms of predictions of imminent inflation in 2009 and 2010, and did they shape the policy discussion away from what it should have been? That represents a really hard question, and this gets to the bigger question for me, which is it gets to. I said that the fifth problem with the standard account is this idea that central banking is purely technical. It is not purely technical. There is much that is technical about it. It's not like it's just naked partisan politics inside those committee meetings. But at some point, the technical apparatus is exhausted before a decision is reached. And when that occurs, something has to fill the gap between what the technical apparatus leaves behind and the need to make a decision. And what fills that gap is going to be values, ideology, worldview. And so in the model that we have now, who fills that gap? We have the 7 appointees of the president who, because there's neither a partisan balancing requirement nor is there a de facto service of long tenures, are almost all appointed by the same president who is serving, right? With very little overlap at the margin. And then these 12 individuals, and just without any clear sense of how they got there.
Yeah.
And my argument is very Churchillian in this sense. Just as you say, there are benefits to this. Tom Honig had some wonderful critiques of bank regulation when he was Kansas City Fed president. So we would lose perhaps some of that independence. But it's Churchillian in the sense that we have not identified a better system of identifying whose values find power and voice in a political system beyond representative democracy, beyond having elections at regular intervals that have consequences for who gets to sit in the big chair. And to me, that remains the best, flawed though it is. It remains the best model. We don't want central banking policy to be made on the floor of the House of Representatives. That's just monetary policy by electoral politics. It's not clear that democracy is well suited. It's pretty clear that democracy is not well suited to that kind of move. But it is clear to me that democracy is the best option that we have at the level of governance, getting to choose the people who choose the people who sit in the big chairs. And so that's kind of where I see there are certain values that we want reflected. And if we reform the Fed in the way that I'm discussing in the last chapter, then we will see Obama appointees hold over to the next administration, just as we would have seen Bush appointees hold over into Obama, to have exactly the kind of dissenting votes and voices that can be so valuable. And so that's where I see as being a benefit.
Yeah, I mean, I was listening to you talk. I mean, I suppose one could have reserve bank structures democratically accountable, congressional delegations or something like that.
Yeah.
But I guess that would be quite a sea change.
It would be. I mean, yeah, it really would be. I mean, even the more modest changes that I propose here, I know that there are some on the right and left who've had enthusiasm for some of these ideas that I've proposed in the book and in another writing. But it's very, very hard to change the Fed. It's got its own power base. This is exactly the mechanism that allowed Alan Greenspan to have so much control, is that it controls not just the money, and the regulating the value of our currency, but it represents an independent political power base in our system, which is pretty formidable.
On the Congress and monetary policy, I mean, it is interesting. Take it since the financial crisis. I take it we've, to my mind, we've largely had, I would say, a Congress with regard to inflation that's very hawkish.
Very
much about sound money. And the question in my mind is, we haven't had the runaway inflation that people predicted, like the Richard Fishers. Although some would say that's because there was a policy change with excess interest paid on reserves to member banks, keeping the reserves at the Fed, and that has tampered down the inflation that comes by way of these Treasury, quantitative easing, mortgage purchase, et cetera. So. I mean, that's there. And that to my mind, I guess that would indicate, well, we don't know how the inflation is going to work itself out. But we have, I mean, one could say, could a sound money Congress control an inflation Fed right now, or a Fed committed to inflation as a matter of policy. We've had near 2% inflation, I think, year over year. So that's not nothing. And I guess it's an open question. I mean, will Congress has the power and the authority, as it does in so many other instances. It just chooses not to exercise it. Or am I wrong? Are the informal mechanisms you talk about in the book, autonomous budget of the Fed, things like that, really preventing the Congress from doing something it would want to do through legislation?
Well, this does get squarely to the Madisonian framework, and that is, the constitutional order, especially as dramatically changed by Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren by increasing the power of faction and party, makes it so it is very difficult for Congress to act dramatically. And I think we're seeing that. So we see in the Republican majorities in Congress, it is pretty striking that the hawkish views have taken such a hold among even those majorities. Republicans have been among the biggest boosters of the Federal Reserve, and especially this conception of Fed independence. But the members of Congress who are most skeptical of the Fed today are themselves in the Republican majority. But the Republican majority is not unanimously in favor of these kinds of changes. So I don't think it's accurate to say that we have a hawkish Congress. We have the most vocal members of the majority identifying as Fed hawks, and we have almost no one in the majority identifying as Fed defenders. They're keeping silent, even as they're exercising their power on the Fed's behalf in closed doors. So it's not clear to me we've reached the critical mass of congressional interest in really clipping the Fed's wings in this respect. And I think part of that is because the hawks in Congress are prophesying at this point. They're not reacting. And the difference here is that in the 1970s, the hawks in Congress and in the White House, and that leads to a sea change at the Fed in 1979, they are reacting. They're not prophesying. Inflation has taken hold. Mm-hmm. And so I think what we would see is if it's true that the inflation hawks are correct, that all of the pent-up liquidity, or all of the balance sheet is basically the major issue. The sheer breadth of the Fed's balance sheet is going to unleash an inflationary tsunami. Mm-hmm. If that occurs, then the Fed will change so quickly our heads will spin.
Yeah.
But the problem is right now they're making prophecies, and the Fed is making a different one. And I would say that the Congress is actually not, although you wouldn't know this by their partisan affiliation, the Congress is still majority dove. And that's what we'd almost always expect to see among the electoral branches. And so this is why being a scholar of the Federal Reserve in 2016 is an unbelievably stimulating job. Yeah. Because I think that there is no end in sight for the Fed's influence and importance. And just as I said earlier, the Fed is constantly changing. We are in a period of constant change, even as the laws stay more or less stable.
So as the laws stay more or less stable, it's interesting. So would the biggest prophet be Janet Yellen?
Well, I think that Janet Yellen is the single most experienced central banker to take the helm of the Fed in its history. No one else. She served, including the present one, 4 separate tours of duty on the FOMC as governor, San Francisco Fed president, vice chair, and now chair. And I think what I'm seeing from Janet Yellen, which is so intriguing to me, is that perhaps because of this experience, she is the most attentive to the committee nature of the Federal Reserve, more than any one of her predecessors, which means that she solicits their views and allows their views to shape policy. It is not clear to me that Janet Yellen herself was the engine behind the interest rate hike in December. And I think that we will eventually know the answer to that, we meaning historians and the public generally, but it may take some time. So what I see instead of Janet Yellen standing as a prophet, the way that we had seen certainly Ben Bernanke and to a lesser extent Alan Greenspan, is I see Janet Yellen standing and saying, here is what we committee of experts have decided based on our expertise, but not on politics. And so that contains with it projections of the future, no question. But there's something of a very much wait-and-see approach in the way that they're talking about inflation, deflation, low long-term interest rates, and the like that leaves me just incredibly intrigued by what comes next. This is all a long way of saying, if Janet Yellen's making a prophecy, I have no idea what it is.
Yeah.
Is it a prophecy of anemic growth, of strong growth, of high inflation, of potential deflation? It's not clear.
Question for you. You argue in the book, powers exercised by Ben Bernanke after the financial crisis, while widely seen as unprecedented, innovative, revolutionary, all of this sort of business, you argue consistent with actually more the original founding spirit of the Fed in certain respects. I suppose size and scope would be different there. But you argue fairly consistent, and I took it the biggest consistency is lender of last resort.
Yeah, right. I mean, you see the Fed returning to what I call the Fed's banking functions. So it's hard for those of us who kind of grew up in the Volcker and Greenspan era to think of the Fed as something other than the last economic policy game in town. Like when the political branches just break down and fail to accomplish the goals that the people face in front of them, then the Fed steps in and saves the day. But that is absolutely not what the original conception of the Fed was. And again, as I say, we shouldn't care that much about the Fed's original conception because it's a statute, and the statute changed. And so with equal gravity and legitimacy, we should be constantly looking at the way that those things changed. But it's also not accurate to say that Ben Bernanke is picking up tools that had never been used before, even including the purchase of assets that differed in both asset class and maturity. So the Fed has been buying short-term governmental bonds as its primary tool of monetary policy, but only since the 1950s. There's a huge debate, I talk about it just a little bit in the book, in the 1950s between the president of the New York Fed and William McChesney Martin, who's the chair, about whether the Fed should abandon its practice of buying various assets of varying maturities. Now, buying various assets of varying maturities, that's quantitative easing, or at least part of it, right? So it seems that Bernanke is picking up these brand new tools I've never seen before, but this stuff has been done many, many times. And lender of last resort is sort of the quintessential example of central banking policy in the 19th century and early 20th century. It's only because the Fed has changed so completely, often in non-legislative terms, by force of personality and experience, that what Ben Bernanke was doing looked so new.
Yeah. Well, it was interesting. I mean, just thinking about, reading that part of your discussion was interesting to me. But I suppose I kept coming back to, and we just had the idea Yellen has the prophet, and you don't know what she's prophesying about. But I suppose it really matters now if we try and think about what the real meaning is of the Fed balance sheet as it currently exists, because she's really, as you know, she's playing with something incredibly dangerous. And how it's going to be unwound. And I don't even know. I mean, I used to know, and I meant to look before the interview, what that amount is in terms of assets, and then what part of that
$4.6 billion.
$4.6 billion. What
trillion,
more than that trillion? Yeah, sorry. Think about what part of that is capital, what part of that is in short-term Treasury bills versus long-term Treasury bonds and long-term mortgages, all of which think about how does this. What's the resolution of this? And all I can say is, I have no idea, but she has truly a tremendous task ahead of her. But it seems to me it's made, but the real meaning of that is is what? I mean, is the Fed now the biggest financial intermediary in America, in the economy as a whole, such that it's directly allocating capital as opposed to private investors, private savers, consumers, entrepreneurs, et cetera? They're kind of second fiddle to these decisions about long-term treasuries and long-term mortgages.
Yeah, it's just a fascinating set of questions, and they're econometrically and theoretically complicated. Econometrically, they're complicated because the question of what the Fed is doing is, what is the extent to which the Fed is creating artificial demand for governmental debt? In other words, if the Fed just sat back and didn't intervene in markets at all, in the debt markets at all, where would that interest rate be? And it's not obvious that it would be so much higher, given, especially in the crisis aftermath, just what a rush to safety we saw in markets and governments the world over. And that rush to safety was seen in the United States to be in the assets of the United States government, in the debts of the United States government. So that's part of the question of, what is the Fed doing? Is it taken over? We've got to wonder, well, what would happen if the Fed weren't in this business? Now, is the Fed taking over as an intermediary is another fascinating one. In the lender of last resort context, we saw the Fed dramatically engaging in 2009, 2010, exactly the kind of intermediary functions the private banking systems normally do, just down to the transaction. My favorite example of this, I can't remember if I mentioned this in the book, is I grew up in outside of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and our mall was Crossroads Mall, and we spent a lot of time there, as kids will do. And what is dramatic about this is that the Fed lent money to the owner of that mall during the crisis, so in emergency lending. This isn't a bank. And the owner defaulted, and the Fed found itself owning my neighborhood mall. It was owning and operating this mall. What is going on with that? So in that sense, it was absolutely acting as the allocator of capital and an intermediary. On a broader scale, though, it has wound down its emergency lending by now. And so it raises the question of, well, what kind of intermediation is it doing? And it is much more in the business of market support as opposed to market intermediation. Not that that's not problematic.
Yeah.
But I think that it's a rhetorical step too far to say that the Fed, through its dramatic interventions in public debt markets and in its previous iterations of quantitative easing and in mortgage markets, that it's now allocating capital and picking winners and losers according to their own sense of creditworthiness, as opposed to creating supports for the intermediaries to make those very decisions.
Well, I suppose even though in the support category, it's support and it's an incentive to put capital in certain places. And so, as Bastiat would say, we don't know what we can't create. We haven't seen it. And so there are foregone opportunities for capital to move in other directions and other investments in the economy. And,
you bet. It's not.
That's just seems to me that's just the problem. It doesn't go.
Yeah,
away.
It can absolutely be. And what I would point to is that this is the model of central banking that we have seen from the 1950s, with a short exit during the Volcker years, where interest rates were set according to markets and monetarism. Now, so besides that brief experiment with monetarism in the early 1980s, this is what the Fed has been doing for the duration.
For the duration. Interesting. Thinking about this question of the member banks, maybe our last question, just thinking about managing with paying excess interest on reserves, and this being the way many have said the inflation has been staved off. How do you see that working itself out?
Well, one way that would be extraordinarily interesting would be for if in the event that the economy enters recession, we're still only at 25 basis point buffer that maybe the interest rates go negative and the Fed starts charging the reserve banks for on these excess reserves. And so we see the rush into the financial system of this money that is held on the reserve bank's balance sheets, but happening at a time when deflation, not inflation, is the real risk. So that might be one way.
That might be one.
Another way is that this is handled very clumsily, and we get all of this pent-up liquidity unleashed at a time of relative strength, and then we see inflation explode. I mean, that's kind of Alan Meltzer's prediction.
Yeah.
But another way is that the excess reserves we're talking about are not insubstantial. They're quite substantial. I mean, last time I looked, it was over $1.3 trillion, and it might even be more than that. But remember that the Fed's balance sheet generally, under quote-unquote normal times, is about $1 trillion. And the rest of the Fed's balance sheet consists of assets generating interest on fixed maturities. And so one way would be that the Fed, because these maturities are all set to expire at very different times, is that the Fed just holds, expires, and destroys, which is what the Fed does often as a part of its usual course of monetary policy. So that when these mortgage-backed securities that people like me who are paying their mortgage send their checks that eventually find their way into the Fed's balance sheet, that eventually when it's all paid up, that money gets wiped out as part of the usual course of monetary policy. That's one way that this might happen. That would be the Fed's dream come true. That basically it needs to do nothing except wait, and then the inflationary pressures of having such a large balance sheet would be over. But I agree with you that although this is not this wasn't a problem of her devising, Janet Yellen and likely her successor are going to have a challenge that no central banker has ever seen before, which is how do you make $3.5 trillion go away without unleashing inflation on the system? Because we know that if you dump $3.5 trillion on an economy not facing a deflationary hole, that the answer is inflation or hyperinflation.
Yeah, well spoken, well said. Peter Conti-Brown, thank you so much for your time and for discussing with us your important new book, The Power and Independence of the Federal Reserve. Great, excellent book. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you, Richard.
This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.